Well, no matter what your point of view about it, it's fair to say that the introduction of legislation to put a price on carbon dioxide emissions into federal parliament this week, it's a pretty big moment in the history of Australia. If the laws are passed, and they almost certainly will be, they'll force 500 Australian companies to pay $23 per tonne of greenhouse gases they put into the atmosphere from July next year. 3 years later, they'll have to pay a market price for permits. The legislative package also compensates households for flow-on price rises and establishes a $300 million steel industry assistance plan. I spoke to Climate Change Minister Greg Combet at the end of a big week in Parliament. Well, Greg Combet, you've introduced the legislation into Parliament, but there's still a lot of uncertainties around it. Now, one of those is that up to half the permits for emitting carbon can be bought from overseas, but the prices of those permits is subject to all sorts of influences. Won't that leave businesses in a permanent state of uncertainty about what their costs are going to be?
Well, we've obviously thought very carefully about the design of the emissions trading scheme, Alan, and one of the things that the business community has been very insistent on is that when emissions trading does start from the 1st of July in 2015, of course, that there is international linking, that is, a business can buy credible carbon credits on the international marketplace. And so that is a very important feature of the scheme. It means that we achieve our emissions reductions at lowest cost to our economy, but of course that is in 2015.
The trouble is you don't really know what's going to happen with the carbon market. I mean, there's still no successor to the Kyoto protocols, and there doesn't look like being one. So you can't really be sure what it's going to be like in 2015, can you?
Oh, well, it's a complex issue that's currently in discussion in the international negotiations, and of course I'll be representing Australia at the negotiations in a couple of months' time in Durban in South Africa, and what you're pointing to, of course, is one of the key issues, the Kyoto Protocol, which provides for a set of rules for the international carbon marketplace, does conclude at the end of 2012. However, the market mechanisms that sit underneath it, if you like, there's no reason why they should end at all, and that'll be a key focus of the discussion at Durban later this year.
The things that can actually be bought by businesses are called certified emissions reductions, which are part of the Kyoto protocols. And as I understand it, they're currently selling for about €8 to €10. Now, doesn't that mean that if the scheme was in place now, that is to say the emissions trading scheme from 2015, if that was happening now, the average price of carbon emissions would be much lower than $23, wouldn't they?
It's a complex area, the international carbon markets, and there are a number of credit units in different markets that are operating, and they're at different prices. And so one of the things we'll be doing in designing, of course, the linkage arrangements in coming months is identifying clearly what units would qualify for businesses to be able to purchase under our emissions trading scheme. But it's also not right to say that there's tremendous uncertainty about the future of the carbon markets internationally. There are emissions trading schemes that are proposed to be started in the course of the next few years in China and California, for example. And again, it'll get down to the bilateral negotiations in many respects between Australia and, for example, the state of California to see if there are circumstances in which international carbon credits can qualify under both schemes. And of course, the United States has not ratified the Kyoto Protocol, and that would need to be a bilateral agreement with the state of California. So there will be carbon markets that we can link up with, but there's some detailed work to be done.
But isn't it the case that between now and 2020, emissions from Australia could actually rise, or at the very least stay where they are, and that all of the abatement that you're proposing would come from overseas?
Well, we'll see how it performs. Of course, the Treasury's done some modelling that shows, of course, that we'll be certainly cutting our net emissions very significantly once the ETS comes in fact, by at least 160 million tonnes in the year 2020, and ongoing emissions reductions. But it's a very important issue that you're pointing to, because once you accept the science about climate change and therefore from a public policy point of view you go about thinking, well, how are we going to cut our emissions so that we can make a contribution to tackling climate change? The key thing then that's been driving me in designing our emissions reduction effort has been the importance of doing it at least cost to our economy. And when you think about that and you recognise that there's only one atmosphere, the atmosphere doesn't stop at the Australian borders, a a tonne of emissions reduction, a tonne of carbon pollution that's reduced anywhere in the world and credibly verified to be so, is just the same as a verifiable tonne of emissions reduction within our own economy.
One of the things that business people tell me is that they know what the target is for 2020, but they don't know what the trajectory is to get there. So what can you tell us about what that's going to be like? Is it a straight line or a curve?
Well, we will be setting up through the legislation an organisation called the Climate Change Authority. It will be chaired by former Reserve Bank Governor and Treasury Secretary Bernie Fraser. And he's a very important appointment to that role because the job of the Climate Change Authority will be to have a look at what Australia's emissions reduction targets are. And, for example, the legislation provides that we'll cut emissions by 80% by the year 2050 and by at least 5% over the year 2000 levels by 2020. And so Bernie Fraser and his colleagues on the Climate Change Authority will have the job at looking at those targets, seeing what efforts are being made internationally, having a look at the state of international negotiations and international agreement, and working out a couple of things. One of them is essentially to do a budgeting effort of our emissions reductions over a period of time, and then to make specific recommendations to government about the trajectory, if you like, of emissions reductions out to 2020. And in particular, one of the most important recommendations that they'll be making to government by early 2014 will be the 5-year emissions reductions or pollution caps in our economy between 2015 to 2020. And business will see what those caps are. They'll know what the carbon budget is, for lack of a better expression, and the government then will put forward regulations. We'll obviously consider the recommendations made by the authority, and we're not bound to act upon them, but they'll be extremely important recommendations to government, and government will then respond with a set of regulations.
And of course the final big uncertainty is political. Now, leaving aside all of the rhetoric, it is a fact that the opposition doesn't agree with you and is saying that if they win government in 2013 or before, they will repeal the Act. So what safeguards, if any, have you built into the legislation to prevent that?
Well, I haven't gone about designing the legislation, on the basis to make it repeal-proof, I suppose. However, and my priority obviously has been to design the legislation as a good piece of public policy. However, I don't see it being repealed. I think this is just part of the political garbage that Tony Abbott goes on with. It is a reform that we need to make. It's actually, above everything else, it's a very important economic reform, and it will drive productivity and innovation in the economy, but it'll also provide a lot of certainty for investors, particularly in areas like the energy sector. So it's going to be very important from that point of view for the business community. I just think it's, once we get this into place, it's a practical piece of policy work that needs to be made, and I don't think it will be repealed at all.
Thanks for joining us, Greg Combet.
No worries, Alan. Thank you.